So, okay, so
you were attracted to, just a quick note on that, you were attracted to the plastics chapter. I don't think I didn't quite get there. My thinking hadn't quite advanced enough, but I kept finding behaviors that seemed very similar to obsessive compulsive disorder, orienting around plastic waste. Cases of people who were like, they had to go out and clean up the waste. They had to sort the waste. They had to separate the waste out. It's an obsession where it's like the waste has to be in the right containers, and people get very upset when you don't have it in the right containers. And this insistence, of course, also there's something around sustainability as a denial of death. I rely on Ernest Becker's great work of the denial of death here, where it's we got to have sustainability creating an immortality project for people. And then I show, of course, that the problem is these efforts to recycle plastic waste have completely backfired because it doesn't make sense economically to recycle plastics. You should recycle aluminum, paper, tin cans, aluminum cans, but plastics should go in the landfill or be incinerated because they're already a byproduct of petrochemical industry. They're already downcycled. The effort to recycle those plastics meant that because it didn't make sense economically, the recycling companies would ship all that plastic waste to poor countries where they would end up in the oceans. I mean, this is one of the most tragic and almost, I wish I could say tragic comic, but it's like it's not just like
plastic is really interesting in relationship to OCD. I had clients who were particularly obsessive about plastic containers, yogurt containers and that sort of thing. Because when you have OCD, and this also often happens to people as they age as well and can't make the difficult decisions about when something is no longer useful, so their house gets cluttered up with things that hypothetically you could use. And the one person I'm thinking of, he had great ethical inability. He had an inability on ethical grounds to throw out yogurt containers, for example, because while you could use them to store something in your fridge, and there is an OCD element to that that's interesting. It's an orderliness, which is an element of conscientiousness that's gone astray, and that is associated with disgust sensitivity. So that's interesting because you also talked about disgust sensitivity in relationship to vegetarianism, which is also something that nobody has really examined, interestingly enough. So
one of the fun parts of Apocalypse Never is that I had never worked on plastics or meat, and they were totally brand new subjects for me. And they are the chapters that people have responded most strongly towards, and they were the most fun for me to write. And so in the meat chapter, I discovered this paper by these Italian psychologists and who I interviewed, where they said, what's going on with vegetarians, not all of them, but a lot of them, is that they view eating meat as the contamination of their bodily purity with the essence of death. And I was just like, well, there you go. I mean, that it has it all, right? All the denial of death stuff.
Well, it is death too. Those animals die, it's more than a mere symbolic association. And it's part of that existential guilt that we all suffer from too, because our life is based on death. I heard a comedian the other day, I don't remember who it was, someone harsh like Bill Burr probably. He said, I realized the other day that every day something has to die just so I can live. And yeah, exactly. And that's a non-trivial, and that's part of the horror of nature that Ernest Becker is actually quite good at detailing. And that's a great book, although I think it's profoundly flawed, but it's still a great book.
I'm curious. I'd love to know how you think it's flawed.
Because he thought that that every reaction to the reality of death was in some sense neurotic. There was no non-neurotic way of responding. And these hero projects were all failures in some sense. And so he's a real Freudian. Interestingly enough, in the introduction to Becker's book, which I read very carefully, he attempted to bring closure to the psychology of religion. So that's what Becker was up to. And he said, the reader might be surprised that I don't discuss any of Jung's work on alchemy in a book that attempts to bring closure to the psychology of religion. But then he says, well, he couldn't understand what Jung was getting at and just didn't go there. And I thought, well, you made a huge mistake, because the solution to the problem that you've so eloquently described is actually in all of that work. And that has something to do with, well, it's too complicated to get into, but Erich Neumann wrote a book called The Origins and History of Consciousness, which is his other great work, which is a real antidote to Becker. And I say that with all due respect, because Becker's book was great. So it's really worth knowing about that other book, because it's a pathway out of the darkness. And Camille Paglia mentioned to me at one point that she thought that if English literature departments would have followed Neumann, who she was very much aware of, instead of Derrida and Foucault, that the whole history of the development of universities in the West would have been altered. And so, yeah, it's very interesting.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, I think the Becker reading of the Italian psychologist finding that people fear the contamination of their bodies with death is that it's triggering their own fear of death. That you could say it's guilt that, you know, all of this prosperity and including meat eating is all resting on bloody horror and death and destruction, and that life itself depends on death. But I think Becker would say, and maybe he's wrong, I don't know, but it's interesting to sort of say, really, it's reminding people that they too will die. It's not just that you feel guilty for having killed something. It's a reminder that you too will die, and thus it's actually triggering anxiety that you're not living your life in the way up to your potential.
It's also, you know, it's also a revivification of the religious instinct in a very primordial manner. So let's say, you know, it became too spiritualized and then subject to intellectual critique, which was really successful in some sense. And so, okay, bang, the highest ideals blow apart, God's dead. Where does the religious instinct reemerge? Well, it goes down into the body, and we start to become concerned about such things as what foods are pure and what foods aren't. And that's it's the lowest level reemergence of the religious instinct. And so the cycle starts all over again. So there's no chasing away that.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say something else, which is sort of like, you know, traditionally, or, you know, at least at some points in history, when you kill an animal, it's a sacrifice that you are doing for the gods. Or a more modern version of that is that you've killed this animal and you thank God for the animal. A more pagan version is that you'd thank the animal. But nonetheless, it's like, I mean, grace, which I've introduced to some amount of resistance in my own family, but it's become this incredibly important ritual for me, is to express some gratitude. So, I mean, one interesting question would be, you know, it's like, that's all gone, but it's like, if it would young people in particular who become vegetarian feel better about it?
Yeah, well, you can atone with grace, right? It's like, well, you've had to kill something. Here we killed something, you know, that had a life and it wasn't without value, and so we can survive. It's like, well, what justifies that? Well, we should at least recognize it. You atone for it too, which is at one. That means to bring yourself into a form of union, and what you're hoping is that the sacrifice of that creature's life is made justifiable by the power of the ethical actions that you're undertaking. And that's supposed to be something non-trivial, you know? It's like, you have to kill things to live. Well, is your life worth that? Or should you just put an end to it, you know, so you stop doing terrible things? That's a real question. That really bothers people. Like, it bothers people to the point of suicidality. These aren't trivial issues. And grace is a very interesting ritual. At least it unites you in gratitude.
Yeah. I was just going to say, so it's communion, taking the body of Christ, taking the blood of Christ. It's a really important ritual. And so if that's gone, and now you just, eat what you want, doesn't matter, right? And then kids raised in that, with that sensibility, doesn't matter. And then suddenly it's like, wait a second, this meat was a living creature, they're not able to process it because we've removed the interpretive structure for them to be able to process it in a healthy way. I mean, at this point,
well, it's also not trivial that you eat the communion wafer, right?
Right.
So that means to embody it, right? In the deepest possible sense, to bring the spirit into your body and embody it. And so, yeah, all that is symbolically tangled together in a very interesting way that needs to be taken apart very carefully. So